Good evening. My name is Jennifer Chan. I'm the director of the Arnie Charbonneau Cancer Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Cracking the Cancer Code, delivered in partnership with the Calgary Public Library. We are excited to have you here tonight for the second talk in our 6-part series, Cracking the Cancer Code. This series brings together researchers, clinicians, and the public to talk about advancements in cancer research and how the future looks for cancer prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and beyond. Thanks to research, we have so much to share with you and so much to be hopeful for. Last time in this series, you heard about treatments and how our understanding of cancer is evolving, where it comes from, and where we're headed as new technologies bring together more advances and hope for the future. Tonight, we'll focus on cancer prevention, screening, and early detection, advances in technology and our understanding of cancer. How it develops is revolutionizing how we are stopping cancer before it even takes hold. From the lab to the real world, researchers right here in Calgary are dedicating their lives to limiting the impact of cancer diagnosis for patients and their loved ones. So it's my pleasure to be joined this evening by Christina Frangu, our moderator for the Cracking the Cancer Code series. Christina is a journalist in Calgary who specializes in writing about health and social issues. Her work has appeared regularly in the Globe and Mail, The Guardian, Maclean's, and more. Christina has been recognized with some of Canada's most prestigious awards for print journalism, including the National Newspaper Award and 2 National Magazine Awards. She is the 2022 recipient of the Landsberg Award, given jointly by the Canadian Women's Foundation and the Canadian Journalism Foundation to honor Christina's work shedding light on gender injustice. Christina received her Bachelor of Journalism from Carleton University and a Master's of Arts from the London School of Economics. She now teaches journalism at the University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming Christina.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm a little afraid to go too close to the microphone. I'm surprised at how many people came out on such a snowy, miserable night, so thank you. This is a subject really dear to my heart, and so it makes me happy to see so many people here. And I'm very honored to be the moderator for this series. Cancer has had a profound effect on my life. A few days before I graduated from high school, a little kid who was like a little brother to me, who was actually my brother's best friend and lived 2 doors down for us, died from liver cancer. He was just at the end of grade 8. I actually thought that would be easier to say. 2 decades later, my husband, who was a physician here in Calgary, died from kidney cancer 7 weeks after his diagnosis. He was 36. A few years after that, my father-in-law died as well of cancer. And so it means a lot to me to have so many people here in this space. I promise you that was a really hard opening, but that is not how it is going to feel tonight. I have had the privilege of listening to tonight's speakers in advance, and what I took from their talks and what I think you will too is a message of hope, that there are things we can do as individuals and as a community to change cancer now. We can reduce risk, we can detect early, and we can save lives. And so with that, I'm going to get on with the show. Here's how it's going to go. We have 3 amazing speakers. They're going to come up and do 15-minute talks, and then they will join me on stage for a panel discussion, and we will open it up to questions, so get your thinking caps on. We have people that will help us organize that, and they're running up and down the stairs with microphones. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Aaron Gudazi. He is the Canada Research Chair in Radiation Exposure Disease and the Science Communication Lead for the University of Calgary's Charbonneau Cancer Institute. He obtained his PhD at the University of Calgary in 2005 and then spent 5 years, I think, at the University of Sussex before we convinced him to come back to Calgary, where he has his own lab at the University of Calgary's Cummings School of Medicine. It may be hard to understand what it means when you're a Canada Research Chair in Radiation Exposure Disease, so I will put it this way, that he is an expert in DNA, and he is going to give you a talk that's really going to sort of blow your mind with what I'll tell you about cancer. Aaron?
Okay, let's see if this works. Yes, okay. the only reason that any cancer has ever arisen in any human is that something has gone wrong with this, our DNA. This is the fundamental basis of all life and the molecular instructions from which all of us are built. And cancer happens because something unintended, unfortunate, and certainly undesirable has occurred in our DNA that alters how those cells work, telling them to grow in a way that they should not, where they should not, and interfering with the essential functions of life. How does knowing this help us prevent cancers? Well, it's said that to understand and avoid a problem, you have to know its origins. And to prevent cancer, we need to know how preventable cancers, the focus of my talk right now, actually start. And so what are the things that we experience in life that matters to our personal cancer risk? And to understand that, let us start at the very beginning. Birth. When we start this life, all of our cells have two unblemished copies of our DNA. You've got half from mom and half from dad, and here you can see parceled into these little things called chromosomes, all neatly color-coded, and just like our little bodies, our DNA is, for lack of a better word, pristine. At this stage, our DNA is at its most intact, its most unaltered, and it will be the most health-giving that it will ever be throughout our lives. As we naturally grow and develop, we have to replicate that DNA. That's how we go from a single cell to the many, many trillions of cells that make up our bodies. And occasionally, as nothing in nature is completely perfect, errors in DNA are introduced as that DNA is replicated. And while most of these, thankfully, are caught by our innate ability to proofread and correct DNA mistakes, a few will slowly accumulate with age. In normal numbers and in and of themselves, these age-related changes in DNA will not trigger cancer, or if, when, and if they do, disease is likely to happen, hopefully at the end of a very long lifespan. So let's put those aside for now. They are not in our control. How else is our DNA altered? Well, another reason is oxygen. Simply breathing. Like most energy sources, oxygen has some pros and some cons, and one con is that oxygen can be transformed into molecules that can react with our DNA. However, as is the case for replication, our bodies have internalized mechanisms that can reduce how oxygen can do damage to our DNA, and if it does happen, detect and repair that such that no consequences had. This is simply a cost of doing business, and our bodies, in fact, right now, sitting here over the next hour, your bodies will be repairing thousands of these things behind the scenes as you have done every single second of your life. So let's put these aside also. They're not in our control either. What's left? What's left are the things that we are in control over, and that are the real culprits of preventable cancer that we experience as we age. There are many, many of these. In fact, so many that 40% of all cancers could be eliminated if we avoided exposure to them. Imagine a world with 40% fewer cancers. Millions of people never experiencing cancer in the first place. Each time we are exposed to one of these preventable sources of cancer, we figuratively roll the dice or play the card or move the chess piece as part of a personal game that we call lifetime cancer risk. We play this our entire lives, whether you know it or not. And on one side of this game is us, our bodies, and our decisions. And on the other side are all of those many things in our air and our water and our environment that can and will damage our DNA above and beyond what happens by simply breathing and replicating DNA, and that can mean transforming ourselves from that pristine state we are born with to the genetic face of cancer, complete and utter havoc going on within your DNA. This is the typical face of a cancer. Exposure to these carcinogens, cancer-generating compounds, are the things that we can exert control over as long as we know what they are, how much we are exposed to, and what actually to do to avoid or reduce their presence in our lives. This understanding the DNA origins of cancer is at the heart of cancer prevention at the level of the individual or the group or indeed as an entire society. And this is a major focus of the work happening right here in Alberta at the Charbonneau Cancer Institute, in particular the Robson DNA Science Centre, of which I am a part. So what are the most avoidable sources of cancer that is understood by science today? And they fall into three simple categories: radiation, chemicals, infection. That's about it. Radiation with energy powerful enough to directly break apart our DNA, or chemicals that react with and potentially fuse to our DNA. Infection that could create a perfect storm within our bodies from which cancer can arise. Understand these three and you understand nearly all preventable sources of cancer. The question is how to identify them and avoid them in your specific case. What can we do? So let's start with radiation. If we look at the good old electromagnetic spectrum, radiation really includes everything from radio to microwaves to visible light to X-rays. However, most of these do not cause cancer. Unless you are actually in the microwave, don't worry about it as far as your cancer risk. If you're in a microwave, you've got problems. It's only the stuff that actually can knock electrons off the atoms of our body that we need to worry about for cancer. This is the ionizing radiation. The X-rays, the radioactive sources, ultraviolet from the sun. So let's start with that. One of the most prevalent types of cancer, skin cancer, is overwhelmingly caused by excessive exposure to ultraviolet radiation from the sun or things like artificial tanning beds. Ultraviolet radiation can directly cause our DNA to fuse together, and causing adducts and kinks that interfere with every DNA-related process imaginable. This causes genetic mutations to skyrocket and also potentially killing off many cells where you're getting the ultraviolet. This, of course, leads to inflammation, that very painful sunburn. That's what that is, which will also increase cancer risk. So the lesson here, as you work and play outside, try to avoid getting those sunburns as much as you can. Throw on some sunscreen or shirt or put up an umbrella, go into the shade, and certainly make sure the kids are protected. All right, so what else? Well, if we're looking at radiation, the greatest lifetime dose of radiation that any of us as civilians will experience is from radon gas in indoor air. And while radon is coming out of the ground naturally all of the time, it is only really since the mid-20th century that our built environment, our homes and our schools and our workplaces have started capturing, containing, and concentrating radon to levels that are unnaturally high and cancer-causing that we can now see today. This is a problem because radon emits alpha radiation. Compared to the small-scale and relatively fixable DNA damage caused by, say, a simple X-ray, what alpha radiation does is it creates this swathe of dense, often completely unfixable, highly mutation-causing damage, which is essentially a weapon of genetic mass destruction. You cannot compare an X-ray to an alpha particle. They are very, very different. We in the Evict Radon National Study, which I lead, have been looking at this now for some years, and we know that now every 108 minutes, another Canadian is diagnosed with lung cancer, potentially never having smoked a cigarette in their entire life, because they've been inhaling radioactive radon gas for decades, most likely in the safety of their own home. In fact, Canadians are now amongst the most radon-exposed people on this planet. We in the prairies, second highest in the world, and to the best of our knowledge, our exposure today has never been higher in all of history. The lesson here: test where you live and breathe for radon gas. If it's high, get it fixed. Testing is relatively inexpensive, relatively straightforward, and any building can be mitigated for radon very quickly, 1 to 2 days work on the house. You just need to know whether you need to. 1 in 5 houses in this part of the world is very, very high for radon. Okay, on to the chemicals you need to know about. First, there are those things that will impact our DNA by producing highly reactive, essentially weaponized oxygen-containing chemicals that can break apart our DNA. Radiation can do this too, and what these things represent are anything that will react with our DNA in a variety of ways and contain oxygen as they do so. Hydrocarbons include this, so particulates from hydrocarbon combustion due to things like forest fires, how many of those do we see these days in this part of the world, or fossil fuel emissions will do this, create weaponized oxygen damaging our DNA. Also, toxic metals like chromium in contaminated tap water, cadmium in cheap and toxic jewelry, as well as arsenic in our soils and well water, which is very, very relevant for rural Canadians. And in fact, just yesterday was in the news once again. All will do this. Asbestos falls into this category, attracting weaponized oxygen through chronic inflammation anywhere it gets lodged, typically within the lungs. Sedentary behavior falls into this category too. Increased inflammation that occurs because we're just not getting off that couch will nudge up lifetime cancer risk the more that you engage in that sort of behavior and the less that you get out and get some exercise. So, what are the lessons here? Avoid these things as much as you can. Avoid the things that produce the weaponized oxygen. Protect yourself, reduce your inflammation sources. Get some steps in every day if you can. Get motivated and apply pressure to those whose job it is to ensure that we have clean air and water and safe buildings. Be mindful of cheap products that you might wear and touch and have close to your skin. The second big chemical category are toxic molecules that react directly with our DNA and become fixed to it for life. These are the so-called forever chemicals. Many of these reach us via foods or medicines from plants and fungi and other natural things in the environment and are a testament to the fact that not everything that Mother Nature produces is good for us. I will give you a couple of examples of these, and the first one you may never have heard of, but you have probably been exposed to. That is aflatoxin. It's a particularly nasty toxin produced by molds that occur on nuts, grains, and some spices. In our bodies, aflatoxin will transform into an epoxide. It glues itself permanently to our DNA in a reaction that's chemically comparable to what you might get from super glue from the hardware store. Aflatoxin and things like it, when they contaminate our food supply chain, come from poor quality ingredients. So the lesson here is to be wary of what you eat, drink, and where it all comes from. This goes for herbal medicines too, just in case you were wondering about that. So eat, drink, and medicate from trusted suppliers. The other big example is something I imagine you all know about, especially this time of year, and that is alcohol. Indeed, alcohol is the most widely consumed thing that increases our risk of cancer. And that's because on its way to simply becoming sugar in our bodies, alcohol temporarily transforms into a highly reactive chemical called an aldehyde. These aldehydes, just like the epoxides I just spoke of from aflatoxin, like that superglue, also react with our DNA. Similar to this, you get the nitrites from processed meat or salted fish will do the same thing. And of course, the big one in the room, which you're wondering why I haven't spoken about it yet, tobacco, will do exactly the same thing. In fact, tobacco is a mixture of all of those chemicals I just spoke about, and in fact also contains radioactive compounds, which makes it one of the most cancer-causing things imaginable. Now, in all of these cases, we might not always be able to avoid these. We might not even want to. Some of these are very, very tempting, or in some cases, addictive. The lesson here is, where possible, practice moderation. Make some choices. Have a drink. Just don't have 20. Don't have them every day. Have some bacon. Just don't have a bacon sandwich every single morning for your entire life. Cut down or quit smoking if you can. All right. So finally, there's infection. Viruses and bacteria that typically impact our body by either degrading our immune system, which is a key point of defense against cancer, triggering inflammation, just like that asbestos might be doing, or forcing infected cells to divide and grow in a way that they were never, ever meant to. Examples of this include things like HIV that can degrade immune system, HPV, the human papillomavirus, or the bacterium that gives rise to tuberculosis, and indeed anything that can cause pneumonia and related inflammation. Avoiding all infection, however, is just not realistic. But the big lesson here, and I think something that we perhaps have all tangibly learned very well over the past few years, is to try and avoid infection as much as you can by making choices that lessen how often we're placed in high infection risk situations, increased hygiene and how often we literally wash our troubles away, and to take advantage of vaccination and/or medication in a timely and proactive manner. These work. So there you have it. We have 6 lessons that we can all use in our lifetime personal game of cancer risk. Careful of playing under the sun, reduce your exposure to sources of radiation, especially to radon gas, avoid the no-fun toxicants like air pollution, heavy metals, and asbestos while moving around once in a while. Be wary of what you eat and drink and where it comes from. Exercise moderation over those tempting exposures, such as alcohol, tobacco, processed meats, and do all you can to reduce how often you may experience infection of inflammation. 6 lessons based upon 3 sources of preventable cancer. All you need to know: radiation, chemicals, infection. 3 things that impinge upon the one basis of any cancer ever in human history, our DNA. And I'm going to leave you with this idea. When we start out this life, we are very much a product of our DNA. But when we leave this life, our DNA is very much a product of us and our decisions across a lifetime. It is up to each of us every day to protect our DNA as much as we can, and by doing so, we might just win the prize of a cancer-free life. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. That was really wonderful. Now we're going to move from talking about the building blocks of life and take the lens out a little bit and talk about lives. And our next speaker is going to speak with us about how we save lives from preventable cancers by screening. Dr. Darren Brenner is an associate professor of oncology and community health sciences at the University of Calgary. He heads up research at the Forzani and MacPhail Colon Cancer Center Screening Center, An epidemiologist and a data scientist by training, he leads several national cancer data modeling teams where they're figuring out the answers to questions like how do we best screen, how do we best treat cancer. Dr. Brenner?
Cancer has a profound impact on Albertans, our friends, our families, and our communities. As a cancer epidemiologist and data scientist, my team and I, we analyze data from thousands of patients at the population level, entire province, entire countries. And when we do this, it's often easy to get lost in these enormous statistics. For example, we know that last year, 6,701 Albertans died of cancer. But even though this is thousands of people, it's important to not get lost in these big numbers. And in here, I highlighted this one number, this one data point, just to remind ourselves that every single preventable cancer case we can catch early or we can prevent is important. It matters because it's our friends, it's our family, it's our neighbors, it's our community. And so it's really easy to get lost in these enormous numbers. And clearly, this is a major problem for the entire population of Alberta. But as much as this is a call for all of us, it's also a call for each of us. Every one of us can do something. Every action, every effort, while at the time, it might not seem like it's the right thing to do or we have the time to do through our busy days and our to-do lists. But together, all of these actions add up for each one of us, and together that leads to change for all of us. So why is it so important that each one of us does all that we can to help fight cancer? Well, despite the awful cold weather, we live in a pretty incredible province. People like me, so I'm originally from Ontario, so please forgive me, don't throw anything. People like me, we want to move to Alberta. We want to move to this amazing place. And we're going to continue to move to this province. The estimates are that the population of Alberta will grow by almost 2 million people over the next 2 decades. So by 2042, the population of Alberta will pass 6 million people. And add on top of that, not only is the population growing, it's getting older. So right now, only about 10% of Albertans are over the age of 65. Over the next 20 years, this is going to double to be 20%. So why does that matter? Well, this matters because although cancer can happen at any age, your risk for the most common cancers, the ones that we screen for, go up considerably as people enter their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So the consequence of a growing Alberta and an aging Alberta is that we're going to have more cancers diagnosed in the population if we don't act. And the consequence of this is more impact on our families, our communities, and our healthcare system going forward. But there is hope. We have to focus that there is hope, and there's many things that we can all do. As we just learned, we know a great deal about what we can do to lower our risk of cancer and how we can work to prevent it before it even starts. So work from our team here in Calgary shows that up to 40% of cancers, or 2 in 5 of all cancers, can be prevented through changes to the world around us, our behaviors, and what we're exposed to. And we know that in many cases, for many different cancer types, we can catch these cancers earlier before they've had as much impact. So we can all benefit from the cancer screening programs that are available here in the great province of Alberta. You'll hear more about these programs and the amazing team that's really working hard to reduce cancer through organized screening programs from our next speaker. So there's many cancers that we can screen for. Our team specifically at the Forzani and MacPhail Colon Cancer Screening Center is focused on colorectal cancer screening. And together, we're collaboratively working to try to reduce the impact of colorectal cancer on Alberta through improved screening and early detection to reduce this future burden. So when cancer hits our families, it hits our friends, it takes our otherwise orderly lives, our nice, organized daily routines, and it throws them up into chaos. It does the same thing at the cellular level. It takes our beautifully regulated processes in the body and throws them up into chaos, into dysregulation that leads to growth that is chaotic to our body's systems. In the context of colorectal cancer, it takes this nice, healthy, circular, generally tube-like organ and changes the growth of the cells and tissues. They start growing inward and form these chaotically shaped polyps that eventually can grow into full-size tumors if we don't catch them early through screening. The consequence of this growth is that it has chaotic effects on our health, our body, our family, our happiness, and our well-being. So to bring an analogy out of the screening clinic and into our homes, our colons and our digestive tracts are like the plumbing systems of our bodies. They move the good stuff in, and they move the bad stuff out through a series of connected tubes or pipes. And just like our plumbing, we typically take it for granted until something goes wrong. So if anyone's ever had a leaky pipe in their home, they know that if you catch it early, it's a simple fix, run to the hardware store, very small bill. But if it's not caught early, the damage is much more severe. It can affect the whole system, the cost goes up, the burden goes up, and it can even affect the integrity of your home. So we want to take care of your plumbing, both at home and in your body. So, in doing so, cancer screening, and more specifically colorectal cancer screening, helps to restore that order. By finding these small growths, these polyps, these chaotic little growths, even at early stages, we can remove them. It restores the order and brings function to our internal plumbing systems and keeps them working properly. So we prevent the leaks, we prevent the damage, and we keep the pipes in order. So how specifically has colorectal cancer been working to bring order to chaos in Alberta? Well, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, because of some of the things we just heard about, the rate of colorectal cancer in Canada was rising pretty steadily. Without being able to bend this curve down, the impact of colorectal cancer on Albertans would continue to grow. In the late 1990s, though, doctors were starting to figure out how to screen for colorectal cancer using colonoscopy. This discovery had a major impact on starting to bend that curve, that cancer incidence curve, and lowering cancer rates in the province. Then in the late 2000s and early 2010s, fecal-based screening tests were developed. So these tests look for very small amounts of blood in the stool that might be shed from colorectal polyps that could be removed to stop the development of cancer. So the addition of these fecal-based tests has continued to bend that curve down and improve colorectal cancer rates in Alberta and in Canada. So the technology for cancer screening is continually advancing. So when we think about the early colonoscopy, it was kind of like a submarine periscope. It was pretty crude. Doctors had to look through this tube, kind of bend down, very crude camera, and it was very invasive. Now doctors use high-resolution cameras that have artificial intelligence-supported software that can identify very minute lesions better than ever before. And just like the technology we use on a daily basis, wherever my smartphone is, everyone has them on hand, it gives us more convenience. This technology in screening is doing the same thing. It's giving us more convenience and more accuracy. So when we think about the FIT test, for example, these fecal-based testing, it's so convenient. This is a cancer screening test that we can do in the confines of our own bathrooms. We don't have to take off any time from work, go to a doctor appointment. What an amazing opportunity and an amazing advancement to help prevent cancer. So all of these advances have already started to bend this cancer curve in Alberta, but there's much more we can do, and we're working on this to improve the future of cancer prevention and screening. So how do we keep bending this curve? Research groups at the Charbonneau Institute, clinical teams are working really hard to advance this science and advance screening, and we're starting to make some breakthroughs. At the heart of all this is trying to come up with research that empowers Albertans to make informed decisions about their prevention, screening, and treatment. So starting from prevention, our teams really know a good deal about what we can do to reduce our cancer risk. We know that up to 40% of cancers are preventable, with many related to things that we are in control of. We can control, we can take charge. For example, research led here in Alberta has uncovered the power of physical activity on cancer prevention and also on improving cancer outcomes during and after a journey with cancer. Our team is working to better detect cancer at the earliest point. We're starting to identify early indicators in the blood or biological clues that we can help to understand who is most at risk for developing colorectal cancer. We're also trying to find indicators that might be used to identify who might best benefit from screening and improve screening tests and programs. The better we can understand our own individual cancer risks, the better we can screen people to maximize the efficiency of the healthcare system while minimizing the burden on all of us and patients. We're really fortunate to have a world-class cancer screening center here in Calgary, where clinical leaders are improving patient imaging techniques and procedures to improve early detection and improve patient experience and patient outcomes. So if we think back to our plumbing example, both in our bodies and our homes, this is like these novel infrared cameras you'll sometimes see on DIY shows or on home and garden television, where they can see a leaky pipe right through the wall. And so just like on TV, when we see it in the clinic, we know that with this increased use of technology, we're continuing to further bend that cancer incidence curve and improve the cancer screening experience in Alberta. So we know that not all cancers can be prevented, and not all cancers can be caught early. So I'm personally heartened by the advances in treatment for colorectal cancer that are being pioneered and advanced for patients here in Alberta with our leading clinical teams and researchers. The new Calgary Cancer Centre will be a home where we're going to be able to tie together the entire community from prevention to screening, treatment, to further reduce the impact and keep bending that cancer incidence curve and improve the future of cancer in Alberta. This is going to give us a comprehensive approach to cancer care. When we combine early detection with improved treatment outcomes, we get greater outcomes for patients, greater survival, and a brighter cancer future. So, moving from the research community to all of us, what can we all do? Well, there's some things that are pretty easy, relatively low-hanging fruit that we can all do. Most importantly, we know that the amount of people who are going for their regular cancer screening is far too low. Nearly 55% of Albertans aged 50 to 75 years old who are eligible for screening are not up to date on their current cancer screening. And this is the lowest hanging fruit we have to keep pushing that curve down, keep bending, and all do our part. So we can start by talking to our doctors or healthcare professionals about getting a fit test. If we don't have one, we can go to screeningforlife.ca to order one directly to our home, or we can chat with members from the screening team who are here tonight. What else can we do? Well, we can also help others around us. Remind our friends, our community members, and our loved ones to do their part as well. So while you might be the one that helps you, maybe more importantly, you might be the one that helps them. You can be the difference for them too. Colorectal cancer screening works. It's easy, safe, and effective. And through our research at the Charbonneau Cancer Institute, we're working to continue to improve it for Albertans and for our healthcare system. So together, each one of us can impact the many. This is a big problem. Thousands of people affected, but every one cancer case prevented or every one cancer case caught early through screening and early detection will have a big impact in our families and our communities. It's our friends, it's our neighbors, it's the people we care about. Every one person can make a difference, and together we'll keep bending that curve. Thanks. Oops, sorry.
Thank you. I'm really excited for our next talk. I'm someone who, I write about cancer screening all the time. I have, I think, 2 stories come out in the next 6 months, and yet I heard our next speaker give this talk and my jaw dropped a couple of times with things I didn't know. There are things that, how can I phrase this? Well, basically, we're on the threshold of being able to use words like eliminate when we talk about certain kinds of cancers, and to me, that's very exciting. So our next speaker, Ms. Bonnie Chang, is the program manager for Alberta Health Services breast and cervical cancer screening programs. She has a Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree from the University of British Columbia and a Master's in Public Administration from Queen's University. She's spent almost a decade now working in cancer screening, and we're very lucky to have her. Bonnie.
This is no ordinary letter. This letter represents decades of screening science and design thinking. This is also your ticket to take ownership of your own health and start cancer screening. And yet, only 50 to 65% of people take up this offer. We get it though. It's not an easy sell. When we're feeling great, we're feeling healthy, we have no symptoms, the last thing we want to think about is cancer. Now, my talk today isn't about the reasons. We know there are many reasons why people don't screen for cancers, from access barriers to fears. My talk is to provide you some information about what happens behind the screens so that you'll have confidence in cancer screening when you do decide to participate. The reason why you are getting an invitation letter is because we have organized screening programs in Alberta. The opposite of this is opportunistic screening, where by chance you find out about the screen and is offered the test. Now, while this may work, it is not ideal to ensure that everyone benefits from screening or to decrease the cancer cases or deaths. Now, we know that we have way more cancers than we're currently screening for. So why is it that some cancers are supported by organized screening programs while others are not? To answer this question, I have to refer to a 1968 paper by Wilson and Younger, in which they set a set of principles that are still used by decision makers to this day as to when we should establish screening programs. Now, I'm going to be simplifying it, but basically, they indicate that these set of conditions need to happen in order for us to make this decision. First, the disease itself, in this case, breast, cervical, and colorectal cancers, they need to be common and serious enough of a problem that we as a society feel we need to do something about it. And that these diseases, we know enough about them that we can do something about it, such as like latency periods, disease progressions, that type of thing. Next is the screening tests themselves. They need to be acceptable and well understood by the users. They also need to provide the right answers more often than not. And they also need to be easy to use. And lastly, these tests also need to be reasonable in cost, in that if we had like 800,000 to 1.3 million people screening with a Pap test, that we don't break the bank and have no money left for treatment. And if we do find something, we need to make sure that we have a system in place for follow-up and treatments. And lastly, we need to ensure that we are able to do screening tests on an ongoing basis rather than as a one-time event. For breast, cervical, and colorectal cancers, they satisfy these conditions, and that's why we have organized screening programs for them. Now, screening programs also operate on the assumption that most people are average risk based on a certain set of criteria. For example, with cervical cancer screening, one has a cervix and is of a certain age. Of course, if you have more risks, like family history or genetics, then you might have more needs. But the idea here is that for most people, and that's the green people on the screen here, who get screened, they'll get a normal or negative result, and they can return to screen at the next recommended interval. And that only a small proportion, that's the orange people, will go on to need further testing, and from these, some few early stage cancers will be found. Now, in our information-heavy age, we know that screening programs are really just a starting point for us to engage with you about screening. It is certainly not as appealing as a program that speaks to your specific health needs. So screening programs are evolving to be more risk-based, more personalized. By that, I mean that currently we're mainly using 2 data points in order to determine when someone should get qualified for breast cancer screening. So that is female being your sex and your age. In future, we would like to also consider family history, personal history, breast density, and immunization history in order to tailor screening recommendations to you. This risk information also allows you to make an informed decision about whether screening is right for you or not. Of course, we're not quite there yet. As we move towards an integrated health information system, we'll be one step closer to being able to offer you risk-based, personalized screening. As I mentioned earlier, that screening tests needs to provide the right answers more often than not. And if you took that to mean that the screening tests are not perfect, you're right. 2 things that screening programs do in order to ensure that participating in screening provides you with more benefits than harms are: 1, we're constantly monitoring, evaluating, and making quality improvement actions, and 2, we're evolving as technology improves. So what do I mean by more benefits than harms? Benefits and harms are value-based for each person, so they're weighted differently by all of us. So for example, if you are really concerned about overdiagnosis, and this is where the cancers we're finding about through screening, where they grow so slowly that they may or may not even cause you illness or death, if you're really concerned about that, then you put more weight on this issue. The point here is that there needs to be net benefits in order for you to want to screen. So the two harms that screening programs monitor and action via Quality Assurance Committee on a regular basis are false negatives and false positives. False negative being not identifying the cancer when there is cancer, and false positive being saying there is cancer when there isn't. So some of them tests like mammograms and pap tests requires the human eye in order to find the change or the cancer. This means that there's room for human error. So in order to minimize these, screening programs and professional colleges set standards and benchmarks. Like a lot of things that needs practice in order to make perfect, like piano playing, sports, mammograms is the same. The more the radiologists read mammograms, the better they get at it. So we have established minimum reads criteria, like the red line here. And we also give clinicians report cards every year so that they know how often they're wrong in calling cancer when there isn't one, and how often they're right in calling a cancer when there is one. This information allows radiologists to go back and review the images so that they can learn and make improvements. Another harms that screening programs constantly monitoring is wait time. We're asking healthy people to take time from their busy lives in order to come do these tests. They shouldn't have to wait a long time in order to find out whether there's a problem that needs further investigation or not. You'll be proud to know that for mammogram screening, Alberta has consistently been the top performer across the country in the least amount of time it takes for you to find out your results. The second thing that screening programs does is to evolve with technology. So while the names mammograms and pap tests have remained the same, the tests themselves have evolved over time, and screening programs have adapted to the change. So with breast cancer screening, mammography is still the gold standard for breast cancer screening. Mammograms are X-rays images used by radiologists in order to find changes in the breast tissue. When we first started breast cancer screening in the 1990s, we used film screen. This is where we gotta wait for the films to be developed, and then we pop them up on these bright screen, and we may or may not need to grab a magnifying glass in order to see the change better. In 2009, Alberta moved to digital mammography. This is where the images are now stored on the computers, and they're viewed on these big megapixel monitors so that the change appear more bright, more crisp to the radiologists and technicians, and that they could tell right away if an image is shaky and we need to do retakes right then and there. More recently, we've moved to using tomosynthesis. This is 3D imaging. So rather than the standard 2 views that we take of the top of your breast and the 2 views from the side, we now have machines that actually does a rotation, and click, click, click later, you have lots of images, and your radiologists are now looking at a slideshow of your breast rather than the 4 stagnant views. We should note that with more images, there's slightly more radiation, but it is still within the safe range. Now, some of you might be wondering about robots. Artificial intelligence is not at a stage where it can be trusted to read your mammograms independently yet. Literature reviews and discussions with leading experts say that machine learning is still being developed. But to some extent, we are already getting some help from machines in Alberta. Some of our mammogram clinics are using developed software in order to identify breast density categories. And the literature review indicates that machines are consistent in calling density categories. Of course, our radiologists are still reviewing every screen and can override the machine's results. Like machine learning, blood testing and plasma testing in breast and cervical cancer screening are still being tested in clinical trials. Right now, researchers are working really hard to ensure that these tests can accurately identify the cancers they're looking for. There's also been much change in cervical cancer screening. The namesake of the pap test, Dr. George Papanekou, first reported that tumor cells could be found in vaginal secretions of women with cervical cancer, leading to his publication, The Diagnosis of Uterine Cancer by the Vaginal Smear in 1943. Pap tests have since improved for us to be able to collect cells directly from the cervix. Since the global adoption of pap tests on a global scale, Countries that have implemented cervical cancer screening programs have seen significant decreases in cancer cases and death. Here you can see the Canadian experience when provinces started to implement cervical cancer screening programs starting in the 1970s, and you can see the corresponding drop in the graph here. Conventional slides were what was used at the beginning. And here you can see the cells are all clumped in layers on top of each other, making it really hard to see the individual cells. We've since started using liquid-based cytology. This is where we collect the sample in liquid medium now, and we put them into these machines, and it cleans and filters to only keep the important cells, and it actually shakes it up and layers it out in one layer, making the cells much easier to see. So while there's been much technological improvement in the cytology world, that's not all that's been going on. Scientists were looking for the cause of cervical cancer and found that majority of cervical cancer cases are associated with certain subtypes of the human papillomavirus, HPV. Since HPV infection is involved in most cervical cancer cases, it makes sense for us to test for its presence first, rather than wait for cell changes with the Pap test. So the future of cervical cancer screening is with HPV testing. There's also now vaccines that can prevent one from getting the certain cervical cancer-causing HPV strains. Imagine an 11-year-old child. This child gets the HPV vaccine. 14 years later, when they're eligible to start cervical cancer screening, the chances of them getting a positive test result is much less. This also means that for people at lower risk of cervical cancer, they can now screen at a 5-year cycle rather than our current 3. And if you think about the lifetime screening cycle of someone with a cervix of average risk, rather than 15 Pap tests, we're talking about 9 or fewer HPV tests. And for any one of us who's ever done cervical cancer screening, the thought of having to do 1 less test, I'm pretty happy about that. The thought that I could do like 6 or more, like fewer tests, makes me actually really excited about that. But wait, there is more. Because HPV testing is a more sensitive test, this means that you don't need to have a lot of special training in order to get a good sample. So that means that, like the FIT test mentioned earlier, we can actually, in future, start cervical cancer screening from the comfort of our own homes. Evidence is actually telling us that the combination of vaccine, screening, and treatment can make it so that one day we can virtually eliminate this cancer. There are now global and national action plans to actually achieve this by 2040. Modeling science is telling us that if we can get immunization rates, screening rates, and follow-up treatment to 90%, we can really make this a reality. It is up to each of us to do our part. I hope I have convinced you that this is no ordinary letter. The science and thinking behind this letter is one way that we can meet the cancer challenge. So I'll ask you this. The next time you get this in your mailbox, be it snail mail or email, what will you do? Thank you.
That was the part I was stressing about the most, was getting the microphone out of the stand. Team, that was so good. And I need my phone up to check the time, not because I'm expecting text messages, but I don't have a watch. That was really excellent. And I think what I'm going to do is just ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So maybe start thinking about what questions you would want to ask. We do have people with microphones. And so what I'll ask of you is, remember, we have a lot of people here. And so make sure that you have a question rather than a comment. And our researchers here can't comment on anyone's personal case. So try and make it a question as general as possible. Ask your question and then just pass it back, the microphone back to the people with the microphones. But I do want to start by one of the great things about sitting here in the audience is I don't know if you could hear, but a few times in your talks I would hear people go, "Wow." And unfortunately, one of those points was at how low the screening rates are for some of the cancers here in Alberta. And so why are we sort of having these levels that are so low of sort of, I think it was 45% or 55%?
Well, I can start off here in the sense that I think screening really, like we try our best to make sure that people are aware of the opportunity for them to screen and whether they're eligible for screening or not by sending like in correspondence and things. But screening is still very much a choice, and people have to take time from their lives. And you know, like I mentioned earlier, there's access barriers, there's all sorts of fears associated with it too. But the thing here is that, like I explained earlier, we do try to make it easy in order for people to do so by some of the innovations that we now have in place, like doing it in the comfort of your own home, and you know, trying to make sure that instead of, you know, if someone needs more follow-up and test that, you know, mammography clinics, they try to get them in seen right away so that it's not a burden.
Yeah, I would add that there's sort of two gaps, one being the awareness gap, which I think, you know, we're hoping to try to address. People become more aware when they should be going, who they should be going to see, and how they go about doing that through things like Screening for Life. But then there's the access gap. So as Bonnie mentioned, not everyone can take the time off when they need it, or they might not necessarily have a primary care provider to be able to sort of facilitate those discussions. And it remains a personal choice, but the more that we can sort of have tests that become easier, lower burden, higher sensitivity with less patient burden, I think the more we can push those numbers higher and higher.
I would say, through our experience in simple radon testing and cancer prevention, another huge factor is very behavioral. We are hardwired to be optimists as humans. Optimism bias is an enormous part of how we think and operate. And when you get that letter, you may be very tempted to say, not me. It'll never be me. It might be you. So do it anyway.
And we don't talk about lung cancer screening, but it is on the horizon?
Correct, yeah. Lung cancer screening programs are being piloted right now in Alberta. They are, at this time, only available to individuals who have a very heavy tobacco smoking history. One of the things we are doing within the Robson DNA Science Centre at the Charbonneau Cancer Institute is looking for new criteria to basically open up lung cancer screening to the majority of Albertans who do not heavily use tobacco, including, for example, things like long, high radon exposure.
That blew my mind about radon in the prairies. Why?
To have a radon problem, you need three things. You need a geological source. We have that, as does a lot of the world, but you also need to be building buildings on it that capture, contain, and concentrate it. And for the first time, well, not for the first time, but in the past sort of 75, 80 years, for the first time in the evolutionary history of humans, we are now occupying environments with levels of radon our bodies have never seen before. And while we are very evolutionarily wired to cope with, say, the damage you get from an X-ray, we just can't cope with the type of damage that alpha radiation from radon does. That's why it's so cancer causing. The third thing is behavior. You know, you have to be in the houses and breathing the air that means you are being exposed to that radiation source. And so we are doing things in the Evict Radon National Study to try and get a handle on this, understand it. It's not one thing in any one house. Each house is unique, just like a person is unique. And we're working together with folks like Codes Canada in order to get proactive radon reduction in the next build code, which is until 2025, but then also to encourage radon testing and then enable and make more accessible radon reduction for Canadians.
And is this something you would just test for one time in your home, or do you need to test regularly?
Mm-hmm. So I'll respond to that with a question is, how often are you changing your house? So, for example, if you are changing the way that your house breathes, you know, your house brings in fresh air, heats it up, and it expels stale air, your house is breathing all the time. If you're changing how that works, you can change how the radon is entering. So the riposte there is, yes, you need to retest, but, you know, one test can last maybe 5 years until you maybe, you change the furnace, you change and refresh your windows, and all of a sudden, we need to do this, that, or the other in the house, yeah.
And then I have a question for the whole panel. Anyone's welcome to weigh in, but it grew out of your talk. I don't mean to make you feel like you're in the spotlight here, but you talked about viruses and cancer risk, and I mean, I think it has to be asked, what do we know about COVID infection and cancer risk? Sorry, I didn't tell you I was going to ask that.
I'll start by saying that this guy right here literally wrote the paper on inflammatory disease and lung cancer.
So the short answer is we don't know. The long answer is we're hoping that we'll be able to sort of start answering those questions. The problem is the latency of cancer, right? So the papers and the work Aaron's referring to, some of this stuff was measured back in the 90s, where we were able to detect cancers in the early 2000s and 2010s. There are some hypotheses that similarly prolonged lung infections, lung inflammation would have a similar increase in risk. And as Aaron alluded to, we're hoping to sort of start incorporating these other high risk factors potentially in identifying people who would benefit from potential screening. That's getting a little ahead of it, but to say that we're working to try to understand those questions, time will tell.
One of the things I can say that the pandemic has done, not a direct consequence of viral infection, but it has completely changed our activity patterns. We are spending a lot more time in houses, our indoor air environments, than we ever have before. We've seen a spike, of course, during the pandemic, but we've normalized work from home in a way, and your house is probably not subject to the same indoor air occupational health and safety guidelines as your office is. And that means residential radon exposure now matters a whole lot more. In fact, the annual dose is jumped by about 20%. That is going to have a huge knock-on effect to lifetime cancer risk for people who live and now work more in properties with high radon.
I might add just 2 quick points too. Sort of first on the radon point, one thing I was really surprised when I saw Aaron's research was that you would think new houses would be safer, but it's actually the opposite. The better the house is built in newer standards, the more it traps the radon, which is sort of paradoxical, but I was surprised by. The second thing to sort of answer the question about COVID, beyond lung cancer though, what matters from COVID is we change the way we live. People move less, they interact less, they have more stress, even though they're out and about less. So, mental health and stress is sort of through the roof because of the COVID crises. People are moving less, sort of gaining weight through sedentary time. So there's going to be other knock-on effects that affect some of those other preventable sources of cancer that Aaron talked about that aren't just directly in the lungs.
I would also like to say that I think to add on top of that is around the fact that I think people miss screens, basically, as a result. It's not a cause of COVID, that type of thing, but more along the lines of the fact that people did not go get their regular screening at the interval that they should have when they should have. So there is that still. We're seeing some return back to the normal rate before COVID, but there are those that, obviously we have missed them. So there's that need for people who should return for screening to come back.
Okay, well, I have a lot more questions, but I know people in the audience do as well. So put your hands up and just wave frantically. I see one, or I see lots. So I'll let the people with the microphones make the call where they deliver them.
Sure. Thank you. That was amazing. I'm just interested in the connection between sugar and cancer. You mentioned sugar and alcohol, and that's great if you don't drink it. But is there a direct connection between the consumption of sugar and cancer?
Okay. So sugar in of itself is not a carcinogen. It would be what I would call a modifier of cancer risk. If you have cancer already, you may not know it, but high sugar can fuel that cancer. Cancers rewire the way that they use energy, and the more sugar is around, the better. In that context. Sugar, of course, can also lead to consequences such as obesity and is often associated with sedentary behavior. Those two will increase your lifetime cancer risk, but sugar in of itself is not a carcinogen.
I was listening. Hi, you guys did an amazing job, and this is super interesting. So thanks for gathering us here together. I heard on CBC this morning quite a report about how desperate women are to get their results from their pap smears from their cervical cancer. That it's taking up to 6 months to get their results. So I wondered, is there hope in that area? Because I think from that screening, you know, when you showed your envelope and said, please go screen, for me, if I do a test, it increases my anxiety to get a result. I need to know the result. If I don't do the test, I'm not as anxious. So because we're not supposed to make a statement and ask a question, I'm just going to ask you, is there hope to get a result sooner from the cervical cancer screening?
Great question.
So, for just in terms of that story, for Alberta, we don't have that delay issue. But if you're talking about being able to find your results faster than the snail mail coming to your mailbox, that type of idea, you can see your results on the My Health Alberta, like the records there. It shows up faster. The only issue there is that you see what the doctors see and your lab results basically. It's not interpreted in the format that our results letter sends to you would say. Like it would provide the fact that it's normal and that you can return to screening, like say 3 years time if your results is normal. That type of interpretation that our letter provides for you.
And I actually listened to that segment as well, and I asked Bonnie about that backstage, because it's a really amazing and shocking interview to listen to, that there is a 6-month delay, but it was specific to British Columbia. But I'm glad you asked it here, because I asked the same question backstage.
I would say our labs are doing an amazing job in terms of keeping up with our test results here.
And just put your hand up and wave them frantically, and we'll spot you.
All right, I'm not sure if I'm going to word this quite right, but I caught that the certain infections can raise risks of cancer. So I was just wondering, like, what kind of infections, if there's kinds that are, like, maybe more internal infections versus, I was thinking, like, bladder infections. Bladder infections are fairly common, or is it after an operation, or what kind?
So you know, the big one we've heard about is HPV, right? The human papillomavirus, that's one of the most common and the biggest ones. It's not all viruses, it's not all infections. Infections that produce raging inflammation across your lungs, yes, they will notch up your lung cancer risk a little bit there. HIV degrades your body's immune system, and because your immune system is constantly eliminating precancerous cells, that increases your risk of cancer. It is not all viruses and not all infections.
We have a question down here, I think. Or is there?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your time and insight. I appreciate it. You are all on the leading edge of cancer research. What excites you in the near term? What have you seen that's upcoming that gives you the most hope with respect to dealing with cancer?
Well, I'll speak to myself personally. Lung cancer remains the #1 way Canadians are dying of cancer. We are on the cusp of early detection of that. 1 in 5 people with lung cancer have never used tobacco, and that number is increasing due to things like radon and air pollution and others. The reason that lung cancer is such a killer is because we find it too late. The symptoms occur too late. They happen at stage 4. If we can diagnose lung cancer at stage 1 or 2, or even better, earlier than that, through screening and the identification of these exposures that underlie your personal lifetime risk, we crack that code. We can then literally start saving lives that until this point in human history, we could never save before due to lung cancer. So that's what excites me personally.
Being a data scientist or data nerd, what excites me the most is the future integration of all of our health information. So we're moving towards an electronic medical record in the province where hopefully in future years, all of this information can be collected and your personal health history will be in one place. And so why is that important? Well, it's important because Bonnie alluded that we right now only use age and sex for cancer screening, but we know lots of things increase our risk for cancer screenings, for example. So we could build that in, that when we go see our GP, they would know your whole health history. You would know you had this sort of health condition, this type of risk factor profile, and so then we could tailor prevention and screening strategies based on the data. Being more passive, so using data to sort of take down the person power, increase the analytical power in the system, and improve all of our outcomes that way. So the sort of integration of all of our health data to improve prevention and screening really excites me.
I would say, yeah, like making the system more efficient, right? Yeah, and I would say, like, I'm working on the whole implementation of, like, HPV as our primary screening for cervical, and to me, that's, like, really exciting stuff that I'm really looking forward to be able to implement in the near future.
I think we have time for one more question. Does someone else?
Hi.
There we go.
Yeah, I had a question about the radon. Like, are there not confounding variables? So for me, indoor air quality is an important issue. There's a lot of new discoveries. Like, I didn't realize gas stoves leaked a lot of fumes into the environment, and they're finding out that it's very toxic, some of the things that we have. And so it's not just the radon. It could be, our carpeting, all the new chemicals that are introduced into the home environment. And then on top of that, the other side question is, when they're collecting data, like my mother passed away of lung cancer, but there's no questionnaire ever of some of the variables that those people may have been exposed to. Like maybe she was a chemist, and things like that. And it doesn't seem like anybody's collecting data on any of these, because these things get complicated and there's so many variables. Anyway, thanks.
So absolutely correct. Lung cancer is one of those things that arises from a complex mixture of exposures. We know tobacco is number one if you look at the whole population, radon is number two, and then there's the other ones, which will very much depend upon your occupation and where you live. Exposure to forest fire smoke, diesel fumes, VOCs, which you're kind of talking about from some of those glues and other occupational exposures, all mix together. They will feed off one another and have compounding effects. For an individual who smokes tobacco that is also exposed to radon, risk is not 1 + 1 = 1, it's 17. They synergize together, and understanding that is at the heart. And so we are trying to do that for the first time. And what's hard is that while you might be able to report your lifetime tobacco use history fairly accurately, going back to whenever you started, how many packs a day, what type of cigarettes or cigars or whatever it was, it's extremely difficult for you to do that for any of those other things because they're largely invisible to human senses. Nobody can detect radon with their own senses. Unless you have a radon test going back to every environment you've ever occupied, going back to birth, it's hard to estimate lifetime risk. The clues, however, are in your body. We're doing that right now through the Evict Radon National Study, which involves 30,000 plus Canadians, where we are collecting, believe it or not, toenails, which contain the telltale decay products of radioactive radon exposure. So in the future, we're hoping to be able to just, please give me some toenails, it's weird, but we grind them up and we put them through a mass spectrometer, and I'll tell you how much radon you've been exposed to over the past 30 years. Other clues for VOCs and particulate matter and everything are part of this equation. To speak to the gentleman's question here about what excites me, that really excites me as much as what I spoke about before. Understanding mixed exposures, and you don't have to do anything other than give me a little piece of you to do that.
Well, I think we're going to close it there on hope and toenails. So first of all, I want to thank all three of you. Aaron, Darren, Bonnie, thank you so much. These talks were excellent. Thank you to the audience for like braving the wild roads and the traffic and coming out. It's really been a joy to see how many people made it here tonight. We'll be having the next talk in the series in January, so watch for the announcement. Thank you to the Calgary Public Library for hosting us and the Charbonneau Cancer Institute, and everyone get home safely, please. Thank you again.